All right, so if we have this kind of framework where we're examining the structure and the consequences of labeling people, first we have to understand a little bit what happens in the criminal justice system. So let's say, for example, that we are in Texas and we have the lone star of the law coming in, right? So this is a police officer. And they decide that you and your shithole buddies coming in, and they decide that you have a contact with police. Important note about police, right? They are the ones that activate the criminal justice system more than anything else, right? They are best in the position to trigger the criminal justice system and to really activate it. So you could have a lot of harms associated with them and positive stuff, but this starts the process, contact with police, right? Now, depending in this process, right, there are two paths you could follow. One, nothing happens, you're in jail, you get released, or the prosecution drops the case. But let's say that, prosecution continues, right? And during the prosecution, right, you go to trial. Let's say that you plea guilty or something, or you're convicted of your crime, right? And, you now have like a sentence associated with that. Maybe it's probation, maybe you go to prison, maybe, it's community service or whatever, right? So the thing is, right, once you are involved in the system, right, maybe not initially here, but after being prosecuted and convicted, right, there's something that happens here. There is a status change related to you. Maybe before you didn't have a record or anything like that, right? Maybe you were seen as like, a normal, wholesome, all-American person or something like that. But there's something that happens that changes, right? A status change happens and a label is assigned to you. And let's say that you end up going to prison or you committed like a state jail felony or something like that. In many cases, right, you could be a felon. You could be an identity thief or something like that, if we want to get crime specific. So if we think about what happens, right, there's a lot of consequences to it, right? Because if you ended up getting just to actual felony, right? One, you had to be caught, right, here, and then you had to have this contact with the police. They had to make a decision to arrest you. Then they had to make a decision to prosecute you, and then you either went to trial or you pled out and you were convicted, right? It takes a lot to actually, become a felon. A lot of pieces in. It's not certain that you'll ever get this far. So once you actually get this label, right, and depending if you do like a felon or if you become a felon, there's a lot of things that, a lot of feelings that come up with felons and felonies, broadly speaking, right? Because one, we think like, ooh, this is a quote bad person. Especially if you went to jail, right? You were an inmate and you did time. You are maybe possibly depending on what your offense is, right? And oftentimes we don't know. Some people do. Some people don't do any crimes, against people, but they do like identity theft or something like that. But you could possibly be dangerous, right? You're viewed as a danger to other people. Possibly seen as like a threat to other people. All of these things could be true, right, about it, right? And there's a lot of consequences that we ascribe to that status, right? So if we think about felons and what happens to them, right, you have restrictions on benefits, like welfare benefits. You have restrictions on housing. You may not be able to find housing, or you find very limited places that are willing to accept having a felon, especially if they do it based off a crime type. Jobs, right? Because if you do a background check and you find out someone has a record, right, then maybe it's not so good. And they, and as a business, maybe you don't want to have that person, serving you in some kind of way, right? Or, if it's like a financially related thing, maybe they shouldn't handle financial data. Or if you just don't want you had a history of violent crime, maybe you're afraid, like they're going to go off on some people, right? Point being, right, is that there's a lot of things that are associated with this that make it complicated and difficult. So if we have this kind of, felony, right, society reacts poorly. Because you also have like these gaps in, like if you've been in for a while, right, you have your gaps in education, you've been in for a long time, and you don't know what society's like. You have gaps in learning about technology, you don't know how to use a computer or a cell phone or something like that. You have gaps in, how to interact with just like normal people, because, the environment inside of a prison is very, very different than normal society. There's all kinds of new rules and stuff like that, and that, you have PTSD from being in prison. You've seen some shit probably. So there's a lot of things that happens when you're inside prison. In society, maybe they're not explicitly doing it right, but there is this implied label and fear given to felons. Now, obviously, there are some people that you should be cautious of, right? And maybe they don't, evoke the normal people, but some people, like they screwed up when they were young and they're trying to make up for past mistakes, right? If you're interested in that kind of thing, like people who mess up and how they're trying to redo their lives, there is this book called Making Good by Shad Maruno. Probably one of the best criminal justice books I've ever read in my life. I could not recommend it anymore. Highly, 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 highly recommend it. So we have all these labels that are attached to people, and we react to them in a certain different way. So labeling theory is like what is concerned with that. So first thing that we need to understand, right, is that there is labeling theory does not explain why someone first commits crime, why the first crime occurs. Not interested in that. Is not really concerned with it. So we sort of dismiss it because of that. This is something that's called primary deviance. It does not try to understand how and why that first crime occurs. Instead, it looks at offending after a label is assigned to someone. And this is called secondary deviance. So offending after a label has been assigned. And what labeling theory decides, right, or is basically saying is that giving a negative label to someone is harmful. And because of this harm, because of it's harmful, because it changes our perception of ourselves. And as a result, it predicts that a negative label is going to lead to a deviance amplification effect. Where people offend more because they have a negative label. Okay, so we'll end the video here and we'll pick this up in the next